All right. Okay. So welcome everyone. Sorry for the short delay. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce to our guest today, Tim Roughgarden from Columbia University, who is a professor in computer science there. And Tim has been working over the years a lot on design analysis and applications and limitations of algorithms, but also on game theory and microeconomics, and especially has looked into their applications to networks, auctions, and as well as cryptocurrencies. And today he's bringing a talk about the latter areas, namely on cryptocurrencies and his analysis of the Ethereum transaction fee mechanism design that's about to go live in a few months, I think. And yeah, without further ado, Tim, it's really great having you, and the virtual stage is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Philip, and thanks for the invitation to speak in the seminar. Really a pleasure to be here. Thanks also to everyone out there in the audience for fighting through the Zoom fatigue and joining me for an hour. Wanted to tell you about some work I've been doing, basically, synthesizing mechanism design and blockchain design with a particular application to a game-theoretic analysis of a major change that looks like will be happening to Ethereum in the London hard fork in July, something known as EIP-1559, okay, which I'll tell you all about for those of you that don't know about that proposal. And I should also say, I'll try to pause every 5 to 10 minutes or so to check in and see if people have questions. But also feel free to interrupt if something's unclear. So let me start just by maybe taking a step back and just reviewing, why do blockchains like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and many others, why do they even have transaction fees? Why do they have a transaction fee mechanism? And fundamentally, the reason is that for popular blockchains like Ethereum and others, you have the problem that you want, which is that real estate on the blockchain, like Ethereum virtual machine computation, it's a scarce resource. By scarce, what I mean is that the demand for that resource is much, much higher than the supply. So what do I mean by demand? What do I mean by supply in the context of a blockchain, let's say Ethereum? A block is added to the Ethereum blockchain, roughly every 13 seconds on average. And there's a cap on how big each block can be. Okay, the current cap is 15 million gas. Your gas is just sort of a proxy for the computational and storage costs of a transaction. So as you think of a block as being hundreds of transactions, but it's not going to be thousands of transactions, okay? So the Ethereum blockchain can support hundreds of transactions per 13 seconds, but that's a finite number. So that's the supply. Demand, on the other hand, if EVM computation was free, much more than 15 million gas worth of transactions would be interested in being executed on the Ethereum blockchain, okay? So that's what I mean by demand far exceeds supply. And so fundamentally what this means is, like it or not, the Ethereum blockchain has to select a subset of the pending transactions to be included on chain. Not everybody can go on chain. So which ones go on chain, which ones do not. And so that's where transaction fees come in, okay? So they do generate revenue, but honestly, revenue is not really the first order point of transaction fees, at least for a blockchain like Ethereum. Really what it's motivated by is you want to use this scarce resource in the most economically efficient way possible. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, you'd like every block to be full, no excuse for not having a full block given the big demand. And secondly, you'd like the block to be full, you'd like it to be used in the most valuable way. Okay, so for users who get a lot of value out of a transaction, they should go in the block. For transactions that don't generate much value, those are the ones you'd like to see excluded. And transaction fees exactly allow you to differentiate when you are in fact submitting a high value transaction. If you have a transaction that generates a lot of value for you, then you're willing to pay a non-trivial transaction fee to have it executed. Whereas if you're just doing spammy transactions, then you probably won't be willing to pay a non-trivial transaction fee. So that's what transaction fees do for us. They allocate the scarce resource of the blockchain in an economically efficient way. The high value transactions get in, the low value transactions are sort of locked out, okay? All right, so that's why we have transaction fees. We need some mechanism for identifying the high value transactions. So how is that done right now? Okay, so what's the state of the art? Well, the current transaction fee mechanism in Ethereum, and it's been the same way since Genesis, and it's really just copied from the transaction fee mechanism in Bitcoin, that Nakamoto himself proposed. And it's a very natural starting point. Okay, something called a first price auction. So as a user of Ethereum, or maybe your wallet is responsible for submitting a bid. Okay, the jargon is a gas price. So you submit a bid along with your transaction, which is how much you offer to pay to have that transaction included. And the deal is, when a miner successfully adds a block to the Ethereum blockchain, solves this proof of work crypto puzzle, all of the transaction fees, so all of the bids that were submitted, along with the transactions that miner chooses to include in the block, the miner collects all of the revenue from those transactions, transaction fees. Okay, so that's how it works right now. Each user, they just say, hey, here's what I'm willing to pay. Miners, they assemble a block, they assemble it however they want, but probably they put in the transactions that are willing to pay a lot. And then, whatever transactions are willing to pay, if they're included, they actually do pay it. And moreover, that payment goes directly to the miner of that block. Okay, so that's what I mean by a first price auction, and that's how things are done today. Now, clearly first price auctions aren't a total failure, right? Bitcoin and Ethereum are extremely successful projects, but you got to ask, can we do better? Do we have a better transaction fee mechanism in some sense of the word? And the genesis of EIP-1559 is trying to have something which is better from a UX, from a user experience perspective. All right, so what's wrong with first price auctions? Well, the problem is that, this has been known in auction theory forever. There's actually cognitively very difficult problem figuring out, how to bid in a first price auction. Right, because basically you want to bid just high enough to win the auction or to be included in the block. And just high enough means just high enough to beat out all of your competition. Okay, so you don't want to overpay. The problem then is, right, so you'd like to just barely beat out other people, but then you have to reason about what other people are doing. You have to make an educated guess about how your competitors are bidding, okay? And that's difficult. To make this concrete, here's sort of a screenshot of the most popular Ethereum wallet, MetaMask, which I'm sure many of you have used. And you're allowed to submit a bid. You're allowed to choose your bid when you submit a transaction through MetaMask. If you choose on the advanced tab here, you'll actually be able to specify whatever gas price you want, whatever bid you want. Most people just sort of look at this simple menu of three options. The MetaMask wallet is basically saying, like, if you want it to go in the next block or two, pay $22. If you're happy to wait, say 30 minutes or something, feel free to just pay $17. And it gives you these sort of three options. But any regular user of MetaMask will have, at some point in their life, actually probably multiple times in their life, have done something like click the fast button here, paid the supposedly high transaction fee, but then actually have that transaction hang, just be pending in the mempool for minutes, if not tens of minutes, okay, or even more, all right? Because maybe you got unlucky and right around the time you submitted the transaction, the demand completely spiked. And now all of a sudden $22 doesn't look that high to the miners. They're actually including sort of other transactions that submitted higher bids instead, okay? Now, there are very smart people who work at MetaMask, that come up with algorithms that suggest these numbers. But even with all of those smart people working on this problem, it's still not completely solved. There really still is this issue that you're not really guaranteed to get your transaction in quickly unless you really set a completely exorbitant gas price / transaction fee. So that's the question. Could we have a better version of a first price auction, which is easier to figure out what the appropriate gas price is, what the appropriate bid is? And for example, I hope many of you have at least heard of, a Vickrey auction, also known as a second price auction. So this is a type of first price auction where you collect bids from people. The highest bidder is the winner of the auction. But what's neat is that the price paid by the winner in a second price auction is the highest bid by somebody else, which would be the second highest bid overall, okay? And a really nice, the reason people study second price auctions and sort of traditional auction theory is they have a very nice property of truthfulness, it turns out. So in a second price auction, you should just bid your maximum willingness to pay. And it's literally guaranteed to always be in your own best interest to bid your maximum willingness to pay. In particular, in a second price auction, you do not need to reason at all about who your competition is or what it is that they're doing. Independent of your competition, there's an obvious, always optimal bid. So wouldn't it be nice if in Ethereum's transaction-free mechanism, it also had this truthfulness property? If there was always a sort of guaranteed optimal obvious bid. Okay, that sounds like it would be a nice thing to have. And that's exactly sort of the origin story of where EIP-1559 came from. All right, so, I think this question of transaction-free mechanism design is sort of scientifically, pretty fundamental, pretty basic. But the work I'll be describing also speaks directly to this proposal that's been kind of, it's a big proposed change to the Ethereum blockchain, EIP-1559. This is actually a web search from several months ago. Now the number of hits you get would be closer to 1 million. You can also see from the news stories here that apparently there was some kind of controversy around EIP-1559 that has to do with fee burning. Maybe we'll talk about that more later if people are interested. But the point being is, this is something that's been very, very hotly debated in the second half of 2020 and so far in 2021. So it now looks actually, almost surely like it's going to happen. So it's scheduled for the London hard fork. That's the next hard fork, which is slated to be in July. And EIP-1559 is a proposal to make the transaction fee easier for users. And the work I want to describe will sort of exactly assess to what extent it achieves that goal. Okay. So in particular, it's polarizing enough that the Ethereum community, they sort of reached out to lots of different stakeholders, okay, to miners, to Ethereum holders, to people who write Ethereum clients. And, this was back late last year. And they asked everybody, how do you feel about the prospect of 1559? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Is there anything that could be done that would make you sort of more comfortable making this major change? And several things were mentioned, but what I have highlighted on this slide is that they literally said that the lack of a formal analysis of the mechanism was one of the things that was holding back people's support for the change. And I want to emphasize, the survey respondents here, these are not kind of like academics or researchers. These are really people in the Ethereum trenches. And they were really concerned that there hadn't been a formal analysis of this proposed major change. And that's exactly going to be, one of maybe the main byproduct of the work I'll describe to you today is exactly that type of formal analysis for 1559. All right, so that's all by sort of way of introduction. What I want to sort of in the next part of the talk, what I want to discuss is basically why isn't this an easy problem? Why can't we just use a second price auction, for example? And the reason is going to be is because mechanism design for blockchains is very different than our parents' mechanism design. There's a lot of idiosyncratic constraints which force us to rethink the problem. So the next part of the talk, I'll walk you through all of that before I return to sort of diving deep into EIP 1559. So any questions at this point? Okay. Then let's talk a little bit about mechanism design and what mechanism design has to look like on a blockchain. Okay. We already asked the question, could you do better? Like, could you have the really nice truthfulness property of a second price or Victory auction? So some mechanism design jargon, this truthfulness property I've been mentioning, that's technically called dominant strategy incentive compatible, or DSIC. So in this talk, whenever you see DSIC, all I mean is truthfulness. Okay. So that was the question I asked before. Can we get the same truthfulness or DSIC property on Ethereum for the transaction fee mechanism? Now, what's clear is, the auctions that Ethereum runs, they're not single item auctions, right? As we discussed, hundreds of transactions are put into each block. Okay, so it's not going to be literally a second price or Victory auction. But if you ask anyone with basic mechanism design training, and you ask them about this problem, how do we do economically efficient auctions of sort of this, this kind of setup, they'll be like, oh yeah. No, people have these very wide-ranging generalizations of the Victory auction, of a second price auction. It's called a VCG mechanism. VCG here is for Victory Clark Groves. And all of the nice truthfulness properties you have of a Victory auction, you have very generally through this VCG mechanism. Okay, that's the first thing anyone trained in mechanism design would tell you. All right, so why don't we just do that? Why don't we just use one of these second price type VCG mechanisms? And the answer is because the blockchain won't let us, in effect. Okay, so I want to explain that in more detail. All right, so why do we have to rethink traditional mechanism design to make progress on blockchain transaction fee design? Okay. So the usual formalism one uses to speak about mechanisms is you sort of separate out the decisions the mechanism makes into two different parts. The first thing you decide is who gets what. And so in our context, this just means decide who gets in the block and who's excluded from the block. So that's encoded by something called an allocation rule. Okay, this function capital X that says who's in and who's out. There's also a payment rule, and this says what do people pay. Okay, so for example, in a first price auction, if you're not included in the block, you pay 0. If you are included in the block, you pay your bid. You pay whatever you said you were willing to pay when you submitted the transaction. Okay, so that's the general formalism for a mechanism. Who gets what? The allocation rule X. Who pays what? The payment rule P. So what I want to do next is walk through multiple challenges of mechanism design in a permissionless blockchain. This challenge is not a new one. That's why I'm calling it challenge number 0. So you'd like this truthfulness property. You'd like users to actually tell you how valuable the transaction is to them. Users, of course, can do whatever it is that they want. So they can sort of lie about the transaction being less valuable than it really is to them. Or if they want, they can lie about it being more valuable than it really is to them. Totally free to do that. Okay, so we should take that into account when we design a mechanism. But again, that's in the wheelhouse of traditional mechanism design theory. And that's not a new challenge for blockchains. The first immediate challenge in traditional mechanism design, you almost always think of the mechanism as being run, as being executed by some trusted third party. Okay, like sort of maybe it's like a platform like eBay, maybe it's like a national government running a spectrum auction. But in traditional mechanism design, you think of the mechanism being carried out by kind of a auditable, if not trusted, then at least auditable third party. That, of course, is utterly false in a permissionless blockchain like Ethereum. A miner who solves a proof of work puzzle can literally do whatever it wants with the block. It can put in any transactions that it so chooses. Okay, so that's actually quite different than traditional mechanism design already. We do have going for us that the miner can't really mess around with the payments, except in as much as it can mess around with the allocation. So given who's actually included on the blockchain, the payments are then hardwired into the protocol's code, right? So in a first price auction, it is hardwired into the protocol that the transaction fees of the included transactions will go to the miner. Okay, nothing more, nothing less. Exactly the transaction fees of the transactions goes to the miner. Okay? The miner cannot make those higher or lower except by including or excluding various transactions. Okay? So that's good. Payment rules hardwired into the protocol, but we do have to worry about the miner messing around with the allocation. So why not use the VCG mechanism or a second price type of option? Okay. So I want to next list sort of 2 impediments. The first one really is sort of not a big deal. It's easy to circumvent, as we'll see, but I still want to mention it. And then on the next slide, I'll show you the real reason why you literally never hear about second price auctions when you're talking about permissionless blockchains. All right, so challenge number 2, which again is unusual from traditional mechanism design, is that the payments, the transaction fees paid by users needs to be self-evident just given on-chain information, okay? Why? Well, for example, when someone spins up a new full node, they need to be able to compute everybody's account balances. To know people's account balances, you need to know what people spent on transaction fees in the past. So you need to know what were those transaction fee payments, and all you have to go on is on-chain information. Think, for example, about a second price auction. Remember, in a second price auction, the winner pays the value of the highest losing bid, the highest bid by somebody else. That is exactly the kind of information which is not recorded on the blockchain. You only include the winners, the included transactions. The blockchain does not tell you what were the bids of the pending transactions that were excluded from the block. But that is what you need to run a second price auction, or more generally, a VCG mechanism. Okay, so what that means is we've got to revise our formalism from the traditional formalism a little bit. The allocation rule, that's really the miner scanning the whole mempool, so that really depends on all the transactions in the mempool. But the payment rule, that needs to be recomputable later by future nodes. So the payment rule should depend only on the winners. The included transactions of a block needs to be independent of the excluded transactions, which already technically rules out running the VCG mechanism. The VCG mechanism, the losing bids are crucial for computing the correct payments. Now, so the one thing we do have, the reason, so why is this not a bigger issue? Why does this not say we have to do first price, we can't do second price? Well, the reason is because we're not doing a single item auction, right? Each block is going to have hundreds of transactions in it, okay? So the VCG mechanism would want you to charge all of the included transactions the highest losing bid. And again, we don't have that. So like if we included 300 transactions under the VCG mechanism, everybody should pay the 301st highest bid. On the other hand, like the 300th highest bid is recorded on chain. Presumably that's basically the same. So maybe that's like technically not a truthful mechanism, but for all practical purposes, it is. Okay. So that's why that first impediment isn't a very big deal. You could just use the lowest winning bid as a proxy for the highest losing bid and get a very close approximation of a truthful mechanism, of the VCG mechanism. Okay. So that's not really the stake in the heart of the second price auction, but challenge number 3 is. Again, this was also observed in prior works that thought about transaction fee mechanism design, which is a big issue, is fake transactions. Okay, so if I'm a miner, I can also masquerade as an Ethereum user. I can sort of submit a transaction to my own mempool. And if I successfully get to add a block, I can include my own transactions if I want. Okay. And at first, you may, like, if you're thinking about a first price auction, you're kind of like, what's the point of that? Like, you're just going to wind up paying yourself, and there'll be sort of no difference at the end of the day. But the point is that with VCG, these truthful kind of auctions, actually fake transactions can boost your revenue. For a simple example, imagine we had a block that could only fit 3 transactions. And imagine there were 3 transactions in the mempool with bids 10, 8, and 3. A miner honestly executing our approximation of the VCG mechanism would include all 3 of these transactions and they'd all pay the lowest winning bid, which would be 3. So 3 different transactions would pay 3 for a total of 9. What the miner could do instead is insert its own fake transaction with a bid of 8. Okay? So now, now the revenue is going to go to 24, right? You're going to collect, now the lowest winning bid will be 8 instead of 3. So you'll collect 8 from each of the 3 transactions. Now the third transaction is a fake one. You have to pay that 8 anyway, so that really doesn't count. But you still boosted your revenue. You're getting 16 from the 2 real transactions when before you were getting only 9. Okay. And I want to emphasize, I mean, not only is this sort of a potential revenue boosting deviation for a miner, but in fact, actually, you could do this in an undetectable way, or it would be very difficult to detect, which transactions are fake, meaning submitted by the miner purely for the purpose of boosting revenue versus real. All right. So really, you really would expect, it's hard to imagine why miners would not do this if you actually tried to roll out a second price type mechanism in a permissionless blockchain. So that's the fundamental reason why you literally never hear about them. You will never hear about these kinds of mechanisms in permissionless blockchains. All right, so I still have one more challenge to tell you, but as I'm telling you these challenges, I also want to be setting up some formalism. So 3 definitions. There's going to be 3 different types of incentive compatibility guarantees that I'm later in the talk going to use to assess EIP-1559 as well as other transaction fee mechanisms as well. Okay, there's going to be 3 different types of incentive compatibility guarantees. The first one is the truthfulness property, or the DSIC property that we talked about earlier. So ideally, we'd like a mechanism where basically each user, it's trivial to figure out how to bid. Okay, you just bid your maximum willingness to pay, and you'll never regret it. Okay, so that's property 1. This is going to be the second property. Okay, on this slide, motivated by the fake transaction attack we saw on the second slide. Okay, so we're going to call a transaction fee mechanism MMIC. That stands for incentive compatible for myopic miners. If a miner, a revenue maximizing miner always behaves in the way that you intend them to. Okay, if they always basically carry out the allocation rule that you had in mind. All right. So the best way to understand this is just on the last slide, talking about the VCG mechanism, that totally does not satisfy this definition. Okay, so on the previous slide, what we wanted a miner to do is obviously not include any fake transactions and just sort of include the best ones. But what a miner really will do is potentially insert fake transactions to boost its revenue. Okay, so under the VCG mechanism, we had some miner behavior in mind, but the incentives were misaligned. Miners were incentivized actually to do something different than what we had in mind for them. Okay, so second price auctions fail. They satisfy the DSIC property, the truthfulness property. They fail the MMIC property. Okay, first price auctions, meanwhile, if you think about it, they do satisfy this MMIC property. In a first price auction, what do we have in mind a miner doing? Well, we have in mind them just picking all of the highest value transactions, or at least value according to the only thing we know about the transactions, which is their bids, to the gas prices that they set. So we would like the miner to just pack its block as full as possible with people paying the most as possible. And guess what? The miner is totally happy to do that themselves, right? That maximizes their immediate revenue. And so that's fully aligned with what we had in mind when we deploy a first price auction, okay? So the VCG mechanism, it is DSIC, it is not MMIC. First price auction is not DSIC, right? You definitely don't want to be truthful in a first price auction. You always want to underbid, but it is at least MMIC, okay? So I've told you 3 of the 4 challenges. I told you 2 of the 3 incentive compatibility guarantees. Let's knock off the last one of each of them. So to tell you about the last challenge and the last incentive compatibility guarantee, let's just pause and think, like, what else might we do, right? So like, if we're not going to use a first price auction, we're not going to use a second price auction, what are some other standard auction formats we might be tempted to play around with, okay? And one thing which is very common in auctions is to use a reserve price. Okay, so this is a price floor. It's setting a minimum that any winner would possibly pay, okay? So in the context of Ethereum, the semantics of a reserve price would be, if the current reserve prices are, like say 100 Gwei, any transaction in the mempool whose gas price is less than that reserve price, so say a transaction with a gas price of 60 Gwei, that would be ineligible for inclusion in this block, because its bid would be below the reserve price. This would be regarded as an invalid transaction if it was put in the block, okay? So that's the semantics of a reserve price. Okay, any transaction with a bid lower than it is just automatically doesn't count in the block, okay? So, and then you can think about how to describe the rest of the mechanism. It's not actually going to be that important for us. So the problem, so reserve prices are often a good idea, and indeed we will basically be using one in EIP-1559, but at least this first cut attempt of how to deploy it totally doesn't work, okay? So let me tell you about the attack that miners and users can use together to circumvent the intention of a reserve price. So again, remember, we had our first guarantee, we had our first incentive compatibility property, DSIC. That was about manipulation by users, having non-truthful bids. Then we had MMIC, which was about manipulation by miners. Now we're going to be talking about collusion between creators of transactions, between users, and a miner of a block. Okay, we're going to think of them forming a cartel, and then we're going to observe, what could they do through collusion. And one thing they can do is completely evade a reserve price. Right? So how would they do that? Well, suppose the reserve price is 100 Gwei and nobody's willing to pay it. Okay, all the users only want to pay 60 Gwei. Well, now they can just cut a deal off chain. Okay, so basically they set up an agreement, maybe enforced by a smart contract, for example. And so for their part, the users agree to submit on-chain bids of 100 Gwei, and therefore they'll be eligible for inclusion in the block. The miner will include all those transactions with their 100 Gwei bids on chain. Okay, and we'll collect that 100 Gwei from all of the transactions per unit of gas. But then it'll refund 40 off chain to the users. Okay, so the net effect being that the miner makes 60 Gwei per unit of gas off each of the transactions. Okay, and remember, the point of the reserve price was to keep transactions not willing to pay 100 off of the blockchain. And we just totally failed. Okay? This sort of side channel to completely bypass what you were intending to accomplish with this reserve price. Okay? All right, so that didn't work. That was another natural thing from Auction Theory 101 to try, and it didn't work because of this collusion between a miner and users. And this is not hypothetical. In a lot of traditional mechanism design applications, this would be hypothetical. But it's very, basically you already see now things that can be interpreted as off-chain collusion between miners and users to accomplish various goals. Okay? So we really have to worry about it, is the point. Okay, any transaction fee mechanism, we really have to assume that miners and users will do this if it's in their own best interest. So the final incentive compatibility guarantee, it just says that it should not, we want a transaction fee mechanism where there is no such incentive. Okay? Where actually the miner and users can make themselves better off by sort of doing something off-chain. Okay, so I'm going to call this property OCA proofness. OCA here stands for off-chain agreements. And again, it just means that basically, you know, it basically means that, you know, like I said, so the joint surplus, so the miners and users as a collective, there's no way they can be better off through off-chain collusion than what they would do on-chain anyways. And again, the best way to think about this definition is not so much to parse it literally and just sort of note that, you know, clearly the mechanism format we just discussed with reserve prices fails this definition. Okay, that's sort of for sure. Okay, and good. Now, meanwhile, a first price auction, let's observe, does satisfy OCA proofness. Okay, why? Well, you know, it's like let a miner and users do whatever they want off chain, right? Ultimately, you know, each user paid some amount to the miner for inclusion. Well, but they just could have done that on chain, right? So whatever payments they made off chain, they could have just communicated those exact same payments directly on chain. All right. So the reserve price mechanism fails OCA proofness. First price auction satisfies it, and so that's sort of where things stand. So Sarah asks, could we have an example of where this type of collusion is happening already? So Patrick beat me to it, right? So for example, if you just look at Etherscan and you see any sort of zero gas price transactions, that's a pretty strong sign that there was some kind of off-chain collusion between a user and a miner. Right? So for example, you might be trying to sort of have transactions batched together to avoid sandwich attacks. But I would absolutely agree with Patrick that that's the number one example that comes to my mind right now, for sure. Basically sort of MEV and trying to avoid MEV. Good question, though. Thanks for the question. Good. So that's where we're at. So I'll pause for questions once I put these up. So what I've reviewed for you is right? So there's the standard challenge and mechanism design that users can manipulate. Challenges 1 through 4 are really because we're worried also about the miner manipulation, which corresponds to the mechanism, the person executing the mechanism deviating. And then also, unlike traditional applications, we're worried about these cartels, okay? And so along the way, I've introduced you to 3 different incentive compatibility guarantees that basically, if you can satisfy all 3 of them, the interpretation is that you've kind of met these challenges 0 through 4. Right? There's the DSIC or the truthfulness property. That's saying basically you've overcome challenge number 0. There's the MMIC property. The miners should be incentivized to do what you expect them to do. That's basically covering challenges 1 and 3. And then OCA proofness is a way of saying you've overcome challenge number 4. Okay. So that's all of the setup, right? So basically, I've told you what I mean by transaction fee mechanism. I've shown you a few different simple designs: first price auctions, second price auctions, reserve prices. I've introduced you to 3 guarantees we'd want, and none of the mechanisms we've seen so far satisfy all of them. First price auctions, they satisfy 2 of 3, but they fail to be truthful. Right? You always want to underbid, and it's complicated to figure out how to underbid in the first price auction. VCG mechanism, fails MMIC because of the fake transaction attack, and the naive use of reserve prices fails OCA proofness. So the obvious question, I've led this all up to now ask the question: so, is there anything which actually meets all the challenges and satisfies all 3 of these incentive compatibility guarantees? Oh, and by the way, specifically, let's give EIP-1559 a report card, using these as the subjects. Okay, let's give it grades according to all of these criteria that we're interested in. Okay. All right. So I'll do one more slide, then I'll pause for questions, and then we'll move on to 1559. So far the talk, at least for someone trained in traditional mechanism design, everything I've said so far has just been very kind of doom and gloom. I've just been saying like, oh, you thought you had this really powerful toolbox, but let me tell you a million different reasons why you can't apply that toolbox, and actually it's a hard problem. But we should also flip that around, right? We should say like, is there anything about the application and mechanism design that we're looking at which actually works in our favor? Is there anything we could take advantage of, something unique about the blockchain setup? And there is, okay? In particular, none of these auctions are one-off auctions for a block, right? They don't happen in a vacuum. When an auction's being run, you've got all these auctions that have already run in the past. You're going to have a bunch more that are going to run in the future. Okay. So why is that useful? Well, for example, okay, you could actually choose the transaction fee mechanism to use for a particular block. So, for example, if you're going to use a reserve price, you could choose what the value of the reserve price was. You could choose the details of the mechanism of the block as a function of the blockchain's past, informed by prior events. Okay. So that's an interesting sort of design lever we have at our disposal. First price auctions obviously aren't using that lever, right? First price auctions are just whatever they are. It's as if it's a one-shot auction. And the other thing sort of relates to my comment that the payments, the way the payments are arranged is really hardwired into the protocol. Okay, it's in the code, therefore cannot be manipulated by anybody. Miners can manipulate the allocation, who's on the blockchain, but given who's on the blockchain, the amount of the payments and where they go, hardwired into the protocol code. In particular, we historically think about all transaction fees going to the miner of the block. We don't have to do that if we don't want. Okay, the protocol can send the ether paid by users anywhere it likes. For example, it could burn it, meaning just take those ether out of circulation, in effect increasing a little bit the value of all the ether remaining in circulation. Or you could redirect revenue anywhere else, like maybe to a foundation or maybe to miners of future blocks, etc. But high level, there's sort of tremendous flexibility in what to do with the payments, given that the payments are fully under the protocol's control. Okay, and again, that's something first price auctions are not taking advantage of. They just pass it all on to the miner. Okay, so the final formalism I'll use is sort of like before: allocation rule X, payment rule P. That's sort of payments by the users to the miner, and then Q, I'm going to call a burning rule. Those are payments from the users to somebody other than the miner. Okay, maybe it's burned, or it's just sent somewhere other than to the miner of the block. Okay, and so that's what we're going to. So the question really is, can we take advantage of benefits 1 and 2, the unique strength, advantages of the blockchain setting, to overcome all of those challenges? Okay, and in particular, again, those 3 incentive compatibility guarantees, we'd like to have them all simultaneously. All right, good time to pause for questions before we sort of get into 1559. Okay, there's no questions. I will push forward. So I want to tell you how 1559 works. I'm sure some of you know, but it's important that all of you know. So I'll walk you through that, and then we'll really put it to the test. We'll assess. We'll investigate to what extent it satisfies these 3 incentive compatibility guarantees. Okay. All right. So let me actually tell you what this proposal is. It's proposed by Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum. It sort of took shape over a number of years. Maybe 2018 would be the best, kind of timestamp for it. And the goal was really, like we said, just to not have this problem where you use MetaMask and it just hangs for 30 minutes anymore. You want it to be basically trivial to figure out what your gas price should be. You really like it to be as easy as shopping on Amazon, where you pull up a product page, it says it's $23, and you just say, if it's worth $23 to me, I'll buy it. If it's not, I won't. But you would love it to be as cognitively simple as shopping on Amazon. So what's the plan for doing that? Okay, there's going to be 3 key ideas. Let me walk you through those one at a time. Okay. Key idea number 1 is we actually will be using a reserve price. If you remember that idea that totally failed 2 or 3 slides ago, 1559 will use a reserve price. In 1559, it's a base fee. And again, any transaction unwilling to pay the base fee is just ineligible for inclusion in the block. So it excludes all transactions that are not willing to pay R or more. Now, wait a minute, you said. That didn't work. We have these off-chain sort of agreements whereby you could bypass the reserve price. Oh, but so here's the thing. We're going to actually take advantage of that, second benefit of the blockchain setting, where we do not have to pass that revenue on to the block's miner. Okay, and there's different things you could do with it, and the game theory would stay the same. In 1559, the revenues generated by the base fee will be burnt. They're removed from circulation, putting deflationary pressure on the currency. Okay. And I should say that sort of the origin, as I understand it, of 1559 was to make sort of fee estimation much easier. But this fee burning aspect has taken on a life of its own, which is something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A session if people are interested. But my understanding is that the fee burning is really a byproduct of the way the game theory works around the original goal of just improving the UX. And that's my understanding of the order of operations. All right, so a couple questions about the base fee. Like how do we compute it? Like so fine, but what is the reserve price? So let's ask, first of all, like what would be the optimal reserve price? Like if reserve price fell magically from the sky, what do we wish it was? Okay. And I claim the ideal base fee would be a market clearing price. Okay? So it would be a price that is just high enough so that, with the current block size of 15 million gas, so R is just high enough that exactly 15 million gas worth of transactions in the mempool would be willing to pay that base fee. And any other transactions pending in the mempool would not be willing to pay that base fee. Why would that be a great sort of base fee for us? Well, it would achieve economic efficiency. The block would be fully utilized, and it'd be utilized exactly by the most valuable transactions, exactly the transactions willing to pay R or more for inclusion. Okay, so this is the ideal base fee. Now we don't know this. Okay? So how are you going to sort of programmatically compute an approximation of whatever the market clearing price is, which of course itself will be changing over time as demand for Ethereum computation varies over time. But so probably the simplest idea would just be to use local search, right? So like start with the base fee. If it looks too low, increase it. If it looks too high, decrease it. Okay. So what does it mean that the current base fee looks too low or looks too high? Okay. Well, if you see a block that's not full, maybe it has only 10 million gas worth of transactions in it, then that's a pretty good sign that your base fee is too high. Okay, that you pushed sort of, because you're not filling the block. So that would suggest decreasing the base fee. You see an under full block. On the other hand, what if you see a full block, right? That has exactly 15 million gas worth of transactions in it. How do you differentiate between scenario one, where you have the base fee exactly right, and it's a market clearing price, and everybody excluded from the block is not willing to pay the base fee, versus scenario two, where the base fee is way too low, and not only did the 15 million gas of transactions on chain be willing to pay the base fee, but so would maybe 10 million more. Okay? There's no way at the moment to distinguish, to understand when it is you should be increasing the base fee, because you need to know how much excluded transactions were there and what were you willing to pay, which again is not on-chain information. So this leads directly into key idea number two, variable size blocks. So this idea actually has a few different benefits, but I just want to focus on the role they play with respect to computing the base fee. So post 1559, Ethereum will actually have more flexibility. Okay, at the moment, the way it works is there is a hard cap on how big each block can be. That cap is currently 15 million gas. A block bigger than that will be rejected. Okay, that also means, of course, if blocks are mostly full, so this means the Ethereum network sort of cranking out roughly 15 million gas of transactions every 13 seconds, okay, because the blocks are pretty much always full. So post 1559, we're going to keep the constraints that kind of on average over time, about 15 million gas for the transactions per 13 seconds are being processed. That'll stay the same, the sort of average throughput over time, but we will allow more flexibility in, if you like, the spot market for gas. Okay, we will allow temporary violations of the intended block size of 15 million up to a 2x overload, so up to 30 million gas. However, if you go over the 15 million target, it's going to be compensated for later by blocks that are under full with less than 15 million. Okay, and so why is this sort of a great idea, or why does it immediately solve the problem we had before? Well, now we're going to have an on-chain signal every single time about whether the base fee is too high or too low. Like before, if we see a block with only 10 million gas of transactions, that's evidence that the base fee is too high and we should lower it. Now, if we see a block that's bigger than the target, okay, and there's plenty of room to be bigger than the target, so we see a block with, say, 20 million gas worth of transactions, that's a strong signal the base fee is too low and we need to make it higher, okay, so that the next block is more in the realm of the target of 15 million gas. Okay, so variable size blocks. Again, it's nice to have the additional flexibility, anyways. But in particular, it now gives us a completely on-chain sort of transcript that we can use to run local search on the base fee, adjusting it or upward or downward as seems to need to be the case. Okay, there is an exact formula for how this works. It's not really important for us, so I'll go over this so very quickly. Basically, if you have a double full block, it's going to go up by 12.5%. You have an empty block, it's going to go down by 12.5% for the next block, and then you just linearly interpolate between those two extreme cases. Okay, so that's the specific update rule. Now, so that's key idea number two, variable size blocks. but we need idea number 3. Why do we need a third idea? Well, because of 2 questions you might have. So first of all, I'm burning all the revenue, right? So like, wasn't the whole point of revenues in blockchains to incentivize the miners to like, rent ASICs and pay electricity costs? Like, why would a miner do any work for Ethereum now that we're burning the whole base fee? Okay, well, remember, there's still the block reward, okay, of 2 ETH per block, all right? That's not changing at all. So every block will still have a block reward of 2 ETH, that'll still go to the mine. So you're definitely still compensated for producing blocks in the blockchain. Okay, but then you say, it's like, okay, but fine, but like, why wouldn't they just publish empty blocks? Why would they bother including any transactions? Okay, why wouldn't they just collect the block rewards, since that's all they're going to get anyways? That's a good question. Question number 2 would be, well, what if actually, your base fee is way too low, okay? Presumably it'll correct later, but what if right at the moment the base fee is so low that everybody and their grandmother is willing to pay it and get into the blockchain? Okay, so in particular, even with a double full block of 30 million, you don't have room for everybody willing to pay the base fee. Now, again, you're back in the position where you have to pick some subset. How are you going to do that? So the same answer to both these questions, which is key idea number 3. Basically, there's going to be a first price auction layered on top of the base fee. Okay, it's kind of like an emergency first price auction to revert to if needed, is the way I think about it. Okay, so 1559, they're calling these tips, just like today's transaction fees. These are direct transfers from the transaction creator to the miner of the block. Okay, so they play the exact same role that transaction fees do now. And so the way it works from the perspective of a user, so currently today, you specify one parameter, the gas price. That's what we saw in MetaMask, for example. Post 1559, you have to specify 2 parameters. One should hopefully be kind of irrelevant or almost a default, but you do technically have to specify 2 parameters. So first of all, the value of the tip, so how much you're willing to pay to the miner of your block. But secondly, right, the base fee could be going all over the place. So you need users to be able to protect themselves from base fees that are just too high, more than they're willing to pay. So users will also submit what's called a fee cap, okay, which is really just intended to mean the maximum willingness to pay in total, all in. Okay, so as a user, you specify these 2 parameters, and then with respect to a base fee R, that induces a bid automatically. Okay, so the base fee is currently R. You're going to pay the base fee R plus your tip delta T per unit of gas, unless that exceeds your fee cap, in which case we'll cap it at your fee cap. So that's your implied bid with respect to any base fee. Okay. Again, the R of it is burned, and the rest of it is passed on to the miner as a transfer. Okay. Now, good. So let me just say this briefly now. I'll say a little bit more in a second. If you're worried, you're like, well, isn't this cheating, right? We were trying to get away from a first price auction. Now all of a sudden we have a first price auction. What was the whole point of this whole thing? The point, which we'll make precise in a couple slides, is that the point is that you should have to revert to the first price auction a very, very small portion of the time. We'll see once it's actually deployed, but the hope would be maybe like 1% of the blocks, there'll be a non-trivial first price auction, and the rest of the time there won't. Okay. But again, we have to back that up. Okay. All right. So I'm running low on time, but let me just sort of pause quickly for questions. And then I at least want to tell you the punchline of does 1559 satisfy the 3 incentive compatibility constraints or not? Any questions before I briefly flash the theorems about its game theoretic guarantees?
So yeah, I have one quick question. So you mentioned that the blocks, the amount of gas that's used for a block is like serves as a signal to determine the base fee for the next block. So is it really like reconfigured for each new block, or is it like averaged out over a certain time to determine that base fee?
Yeah. So I mean, as operationally, it's literally just this formula. So you literally take the last block's base fee and you multiply it by a number which might be a little bit more, a little bit less than 1, and this is the exact formula for what that number is. Mm-hmm. Now, you could ask. So, I mean, one question would be, to what extent does the current base fee reflect the average throughput of the Ethereum blockchain up to this point? And they're not, it's not, there's a slight mismatch. Okay, so it doesn't exactly track the average throughput of the Ethereum blockchain over all of time. At least it's not guaranteed to, but it's pretty close.
Okay.
So as a mental model, you can also think of it as, what's happened to this point. If we're averaging too high, then the base fee should be going down. If we're averaging too low, the base fee should be going up.
Yeah.
If we're averaging 15, then the base fee should be right where it is, basically.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so there is this first price auction backup. The hope is that most of the time that won't be relevant. So let me explain what I mean by that. All right, so to what extent does this new transaction fee mechanism satisfy these three constraints? Okay, so let's go through them one at a time in a different order than I introduced them to you. Let's start with MMIC. So remember, this is the property that the miner is incentivized to behave in the way that you had in mind for them to behave. Okay, so what do we have in mind in 1559? Well, so the miner gets the block reward no matter what. The miner doesn't get the base fee revenues no matter what. So the only thing the miner has any control over is the tips. Okay, and those are again transfers from the users to the miner. So we're basically thinking, what do we expect the miner to do? What's our intention? Our intention is for them to pack a block as full as possible. Now remember, some of the transactions are not going to be willing to pay the base fee, so the miner can't include them even if it wants. So it's going to include eligible transactions, those willing to pay the base fee. And if it doesn't have room for everybody in a double full block, if it doesn't have room for everybody, we expect it to just choose the ones with the highest tips. Just like today, we expect miners to choose the transactions with the highest gas prices. And just like in a first price auction, miners are totally happy to do this. We've literally built the mechanism exactly so that the intention is for miners to maximize their tip revenue. I should also mention, and notice, fake transactions are now a totally horrible idea for a miner, because now actually they don't even recoup that transaction fee of their own transaction, right? It gets burned. So they're strictly disincentivized from having any kind of fake transactions, and they're totally happy to just include the highest tip ones. Okay, so this is just a sanity check. First price auction was MMIC. We haven't lost that. We still have that. How about OCA proof? This was the property that says it shouldn't be the case that miners and users can collude off chain to defeat the protocol, like they could with our first attempt of a reserve price. Okay. And again, the 1559 mechanism, like first price auctions, is guaranteed to be OCA proof. And so again, there's sort of two really crucial properties about how the base fee is used here. Key property number one is that it's burned, or at least does not go to the miner. Okay. In other words, in our initial attempt, the whole problem was that the base fee revenues were staying inside the cartel. Okay, they were just a transfer from some members of the cartel, the users, to a different miner of the cartel, a different member of the cartel, the miner. Okay, so it didn't go out of their sort of collective system, and that's why it had no effects. If you're burning it, well, and taking it out of circulation, that's an actual loss to the cartel. Okay, there's no way the cartel can recover that by just moving money back and forth amongst its own members. So that's exactly the game theoretic role the fee burn plays here, is it enables this OCA proofness, because the burn goes outside of the cartel. Cartel can't recapture it no matter what it does. It's also important that the base fee is a deterministic function of the previous blocks. Okay, so I may not have emphasized this earlier. I should have. So the base fee, nobody can interfere with the base fee of the current block. It's independent of what the current miner does. It's independent of the included transactions. It's completely set once and for all by the strict predecessors of the current block on the longest chain. Okay, so that's also important for OCA proofness. There's no way that you can manipulate the base fee of the block that you're currently in. It's already been set by the past. Okay, so this is just a sanity check. We've convinced ourselves that the 1559 mechanism at least has the same two nice guarantees that today's first price auctions do. They're MMIC and they're OCA proof. And remember, VCG mechanisms were not MMIC, and our initial reserve price attempt was not OCA proof. Okay, so at least we're not doing any worse than first price auctions. But the whole point of 1559 is to do better, okay, meaning to not be as hard to bid in as a first price auction, and instead have something like a truthfulness property like you'd have for a second price auction. Now, this mechanism obviously is not guaranteed to be a truthful mechanism. It's not guaranteed to be DSIC, because it includes as a special case, when the base fee is zero, it includes as a special case a first price auction, right? Which we know is not DSIC. Okay, but now you're saying it's like, well, why on earth is the base fee zero, right? I mean, the only reason the base fee is going to be zero is if you consistently had blocks that were less than the target of 15 million, which basically means the Ethereum blockchain is not a scarce resource, and you may as well just set sort of a nominal tip, and you'll be fine. It's like, who cares, right? So the only reason the base fee would be 0 is if there was no demand, but there is demand, so there's going to be a non-trivial base fee. More generally, if the base fee is way off, way too low, okay, in the sense that more than even so the amount of transactions willing to pay the current base fee, if they don't even fit in a double full block, okay, that's kind of the failure mode, okay? Because then basically, you know, as a user, you're not guaranteed entrance into the block. You have to compete with the other transactions through tips, just like in today's first price auctions, okay? So in general, you know, this mechanism is not going to be truthful in the event that the base fee is excessively low, in the sense that more than a double full block worth of transactions is willing to pay it. Now, the hope is that the base fee is not going to be excessively low very often, right? So like, why would it happen? The reason it would happen is if you're coming from a sort of period of very stable low demand, and then you have a sudden demand shock, and you're going into a sort of regime of very high demand, you know, because of an ICO or any number of other reasons. Now, you know, you wait like 10 blocks, you know, you wait a couple minutes, and the base fee, right, it's, you know, so when the demand goes way up, the blocks, you know, the miner's going to pack the blocks sort of very full, the base fee will rise, and it'll get to where it needs to be. It'll get up to the market clearing price at the new increased level of demand. But there will still be this transitory period, you know, of maybe 5 blocks, 10 blocks, 20 blocks, something like that, where the base fee hasn't caught up to where it needs to be. So those are going to be the exceptional periods when you're transitioning from low to high demands. So just in that little bit in between, that's where you're going to expect this loss of truthfulness, which again, hopefully is going to be like 1% of the blocks. We'll see, but that would be my hope, that it would be really just a very small, you know, really an edge case that only happens once in a while, okay? All right, so is that the only obstruction to truthfulness? Well, there's one other annoying one, which is you have to make sort of a minimal, right? So in a second price auction, you don't care what other people are doing. Other people can be arbitrarily stupid. You're still guaranteed that a truthful bid is optimal for you. That's not going to be quite true. If other users are behaving in a very stupid way, meaning they're overbidding, if they're setting their fee cap, so if they're telling the protocol they're willing to pay more than they're really willing to pay, which of course exposes them to risks that they really shouldn't be taking. There's literally no reason to do that. It's a dominated strategy. But technically, you know, if people do overbid, then the base fee can act excessively low, even though it's not, just because you have a false impression of what the demand is from people's overbids on chain. So that's sort of another just sort of technical point that, you know, you also have to make this minimal behavioral assumption. But the good news is those are the only 2 obstructions to achieving truthfulness. So really, all you have to do is assume that the base fee is not excessively low, which is hopefully true 99% of the time. And you have to assume that everybody is, you know, nobody's so stupid as to sort of say they're willing to pay more than they're really willing to pay. Under those 2 assumptions, then in fact, 1559 is just as good as a second price auction. Okay, it's truthful. You're guaranteed that just setting your fee cap equal to the valuation and setting the tip to be some nominal amount like 1 or 2 gwei, that's going to be an optimal strategy for the user. Okay. So again, sort of the takeaway here is, and this is really, I think, a success story for the proposed change. It preserves the 2 game-theoretic properties we already had, and it leverages the unique advantages of the blockchain setting to get not all the way to the truthfulness property that we have in second price auctions, but pretty close. 99% of the time, under a pretty weak behavioral assumption, it's as good as the second price auction. Whereas, of course, first price auctions, it's never a good idea to do truthful bidding. It's never easy to figure out what to do in a first price auction. This is saying it's going to be usually, hopefully, easy to figure out what to do with 1559. Okay, so that's the report part, and definitely over time. So in the report, there's a couple alternative mechanisms. I've sort of mentioned them. Instead of burning fees, you can pay them forward to miners of future blocks. You could imagine reducing the number of parameters from 2 to 1 by hard coding the tip. That actually gives you a full-blown DSIC property, but you do lose OCA proofness in these sort of transitory regimes with an excessively low base fee. Anyways, if you want more details on the alternative designs I discussed, check out the reports. I'm going to leave you with a few open problems. I won't go through them. I'll just sort of leave them up on the slide, and happy to proceed to Q&A. So thanks again very much for inviting me and for attending the seminar.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the great talk, Tim. That was really very insightful. I'll stop the recording, and then we switch over to the Q&A session.